My story began with a death sentence.
My beginning is before AIDS.
She talked about this new disease. It was going to change the face of medicine in South Africa.
Very few of us had any understanding of the epidemic.
Really, I had absolute, complete faith in the fact that, science would prevail.
When the epidemic first came, I thought it really didn't concern us. It was a problem of white gay males in California, and that was a dreadful mistake because, as you've seen, from the 80s, we've become the worst affected country in the entire world.
We had HIV. We didn't have the drugs at that stage.
The drugs haven't arrived.
Who could afford to be on the antiretrovirals? And you were talking about $10,000 a year.
Yeah.
We had this real view that there was new hope. I think we were all a bit patient. We were saying, Mbeki comes to power and we need to allow him a bit of time to bed down. Same was true for Mantu.
What I kept hearing was, you wanted a policy on treatment, you've got it.
Some of the memories I have is of a lot of people dying, a lot of friends dying, personal confrontations that I had which were unpleasant with the former Minister of Health.
It was already known that the infection in children can be prevented, and yet they were still dragging off feet.
There was a bit of conflation of the issues. We then got into a bit of a debate which polarized us as a country.
As we grew, AIDS denialism hardened. As it hardened, we had to fight it harder. As we fought it harder, Thabo Mbeki, being a proud and arrogant man, hardened his position further, and unfortunately we got into a kind of, I think, vicious spiral.
There were very few people who supported us fighting Thabo Mbeki. And within the government itself, if there is a handful I can think of who stood up, it's a lot.
From an international perspective, we were embarrassed.
Bearing in mind that it's always been the case that an effective response will have to be a national response.
What moved and inspired and motivated you in those days was the personal interactions with people.
I think it's right to capture this history.
Sometimes when I train students, or work with students, which is a lot of what I do on the campus and enjoy very much, is to say that I came out as a sexually active person and gay man in the late 1970s, which was before AIDS. And so I had the privilege, in a way, of starting on my sort of sexual journey in life and my identity journey prior to this fear of HIV, this thing that sort of loomed over us from the early 1980s. And it's quite a unique perspective to have, I think. And I suppose my beginning is before AIDS, because there was a sense of freedom and lack of fear, although at the time South Africa was still in the grips of apartheid and life was segregated racially primarily, although gay lives did manage to cross those boundaries. But I remember the worst thing was about being found out or being entrapped in some way or being prosecuted under the Immorality Act. Which governed sex across the colour line as well as sex between two men or two women, or maybe two men, I think. Not sure about two women. AIDS just wasn't part of my reality, and those were the disco years. I Will Survive, and so when the young kids today dance to the remixes, they think this is a new song. I'm always vaguely amused. And then, in the early 80s, I think, starting to hear about this new disease was
gay cancer.
Yeah, or GRID as well. It was gay-related immune deficiency. It was one of the early technical terms that formulated by doctors in the US. But I started dating somebody in I think 1981 when I came to Pretoria, and for national service, as it turns out. I was a product of 2 years of national service. I was 21 at the time. And the partner that I met then and subsequently was involved with for about 5 years traveled a lot. He loved international travel, particularly to New York. And I think, you know, through him, I already began to get a sense that this was quite scary. And one of his very close school friends had emigrated to the UK and subsequently became HIV positive before I think a test was even available. It was just called AIDS. By then it was called AIDS. And I remember he came to South Africa when he was probably in the last stages of AIDS, and he was clearly very ill. And it was just, I suppose, just associated with fear, death, panic, anxiety, you know, not knowing what to do or whether you were affected. And I think in a way we felt somewhat protected in South Africa because although people were traveling internationally, it wasn't as easy, and there was a sense that it was a disease of America or maybe to some extent the UK, but not Africa yet, you know. But I mean, I think it became very clear that it had come to South Africa in the white gay male community, particularly people who traveled, and then of course it would, you know, flight attendants or people who had resources and money, disposable income, and then.
What did you see that made it clear? Can you remember anything in particular that made you realize that this was here in South Africa?
This is really dredging back my long-term memory. I suppose just people who were ill. You know, I mean, never mind that the news headlines started to filter through these stories about the gay plague and the horror and the doom and the gloom and the pictures of men with KS lesions and but you know, it became clear that people we knew, either in your immediate or further friendship circle, were infected. I mean, this friend, I think his name was Ivan Cohen, I may be wrong, was the first person I think that I met that I knew absolutely had AIDS. And I do remember feeling incredibly distressed by the experience, that he seemed very, very afraid. At that point, I hadn't started my training as a psychologist. I was just someone who, in fact, had started working for a small gay and lesbian helpline in Johannesburg. This was in the sort of around about maybe 83, 82, 83, 84, somewhere around there. And so I was already interested in counseling and reaching out, I suppose, to people who were troubled in some way. And it was a very small, very modest little sort of community-run service, which was operated at night between 7 and 10.
This was in Pretoria?
Johannesburg. By then I'd moved to Johannesburg after my national service.
Where in Johannesburg was that?
Where was it located?
Yeah.
That's a good question. It moved around a bit. I think it was in Berea for a bit, and then it was in fact in Hillbrow. I remember going into this terribly seedy little one-bedroomed flat in Hillbrow when we would counsel from, just you and a telephone. You know, talking to people who thought they might be gay or lesbian, or had relationship difficulties, or their boyfriend was beating them up or something. That was sort of, the early 80s period. And one of the persons who I trained with at that time to become a counsellor subsequently developed AIDS. And I remember we formed a small support group for him. In fact, there was even a little initiative, I think, that was a flow out of this gay counseling service. It was called the Gay Advice Bureau, I think, or GAB, as in the gift of. And this guy developed AIDS, and we formed a small support group informally for him. And I think subsequently, as I said, it sort of, they tried to form, this organization tried to form a more consistent outreach kind of offering. But we did things like go to his home and, you know, tidied up his house and his garden and did chores and formed rosters. I mean, at that stage there were no treatments. You know, there was just nothing really, except, I suppose, attempts to manage symptoms and offer palliation of some kind. And but I think my overwhelming feeling about that period, you know, sort of from the sort of early, middle, late 80s, was a feeling that slowly people were just disappearing and dying, you know, and that the gay community was truly being besieged by AIDS, you know, and it had a terrible sense of democracy about it. It seemed to cross all lines and classes, and people who were beautiful and rich got HIV just as much as people who were not. And it almost felt like the community was imploding. I mean, I suppose with hindsight, I'm trying to remember how I felt at the time, but a profound sense of fear, but sadness and loss, I think, started to sort of creep into people's conversations and into your consciousness, and maybe even into your unconsciousness, I suppose. This anxiety about AIDS just being around. And then I think in the late, around about 1987 or so, I think just before I started my master's training in psychology, which I think I started in 1988, and I met Peter Bassi, who may have come up in some of these other conversations, and Peter, you know, was one of the, I suppose, the inspiring people to meet at the beginning of your own journey in the field, because he had an incredible charisma and charm and ability to reach out to people and to connect. I think that was probably the most profound part of him that people could resonate with, was that he just connected. Was it Auden who said only connect as a sort of your life script? You know, if you only connect, it's the best thing you can do in life, or the most profound expression of your humanness. And Peter had that down to an art. I mean, he just connected with people, black, white, young, old, gay, straight. Everybody loved him. I mean, he was sort of universally adored. That changed. I mean, some of the politics of AIDS in South Africa meant that at some points Peter, I think, diverged with some of the directions that some of the AIDS activism was going. Not because he didn't support it, but because I think he just felt that there were different ways and different agendas, and he, you know, he became unpopular in some quarters. But nevertheless, I mean, I think he, with some difficulty, rode that out and remained, you know, incredibly important to lots of people. The politics are of different kinds and at different levels, because I think the overwhelming response to AIDS in the gay community was a community-led response. I mean, mostly, I suppose, by white, mostly men, gay men, because the organizations were themselves segregated, and that I think that became more problematic as time passed, that different kinds of gay men were affected and infected, and I think the services and programs didn't manage to straddle those divisions. But in the beginning, all the responses were from within the gay worlds, and from the perspective of the state, it was clear that they weren't going to do anything about it. So for me, that was already a political gesture of ignoring the epidemic in the gay community. I mean, I do remember very clearly the Minister of Health, a female Minister of Health, I can't remember, Rena Fenter maybe, yeah, said, you know, this is a problem for the gay community, and it's not a mainstream issue, it's not a problem that South Africans in general are affected by, and the gay community needs to look after itself. You know, there was no sense that there were any resources going to be put to this at all. And I think towards the late 80s, the other politics that started to creep in were around the fact that the first really proper HIV clinic in South Africa was run at the Johannesburg Hospital by some pioneer doctors who were both gay men. I think Stephen Miller and Dennis Sifris were the early pioneers, along with Reuben Scher. Reuben wasn't a gay man. In fact, he was basically a Jewish grandfather who had gotten interested in I think, immunology because he had a son who had some immunosuppressant illness, not HIV. And he'd been in the US and come back to South Africa with an understanding that AIDS was affecting the gay community. He was also one of the early people who got involved. And in fact, he helped to set up one of the first AIDS training and information centers. I think they were called ATICs in Braamfontein. And it was through that ATIC and its work that I began to meet Peter in the late 1980s, because he got somehow attached to them, and we were overlapping around counseling. I think we were beginning to offer some of the first HIV test counseling at that time, because the test was identified in 85. So already, you know, tests were beginning to be available here after that. And that's where Peter and my lives started to overlap, through the AIDS Training and Information Centre in Braamfontein, which Reuben Scher started. But I think, you know, Reuben and Dennis and Steve Miller were the early pioneers in trying to treat and test the people who were affected and coming forward, which were gay men, and fighting with government for space in the hospital, fighting for staff. They were fighting with Reuben and Dennis and Steve were fighting for the right to exist, basically, to have this clinic. Because, I mean, the stigma was, I mean, huge. AIDS had its own stigmas, and of course homosexuality was still illegal, and so there was this clinic primarily for gay men. I mean, a lot of the people who were using that service were working class white gay men, but not exclusively, but mostly, because if you had private health insurance, you went to see Steve and Dennis privately. I seem to remember a lot of them were Afrikaans white gay men as well at that time, but
openly gay?
Yeah.
I mean, not
No, I mean, clearly very much. They weren't all Afrikaans, but I do remember that being a feature of it partly. So when I'd started my master's in 88, and then in 89, in my part of my internship, I worked in the Johannesburg Hospital. So I chose to rotate through the clinic as part of that 6-month block that I was in the Johannesburg Hospital. And it was also a very bleak experience. I mean, I just felt pretty powerless. I mean, I was just a beginner therapist, and felt like that the disease was just so immensely powerful and depressing and pervasive and shocking. I mean, because, you know, we were really seeing all those extreme symptoms, you know, that can come particularly as your immune system gets more and more compromised. So I don't particularly think I did very much good work at that time, to be honest. I mean, it just felt like you were stabbing in the dark and trying to support people going through something pretty horrendous. I do remember, though, even then, there were other people who came to the clinic who were not gay. I remember vividly counselling an old white couple where one partner had been infected, I think, through a transfusion, and then had infected his wife. And they were, I think, a bit like Toto, I don't think we were in Kansas anymore moment for them, sort of feeling really, themselves feeling other, having an othering disease, but in a clinic which primarily aimed at helping gay men. And they were an elderly heterosexual couple in the same clinic, so they were really, really out of place. And even then, I remember there was a hint that the demographics of AIDS were beginning to shift, that there were some black South Africans who were heterosexual, some of them from overseas, coming to the clinic. And I suppose as that moved into the 90s, the issue of returnees coming back with HIV also began to be part of the story, which was another strand of our AIDS epidemic that I think is sometimes forgotten, that people who'd lived in exile and for good sociological reasons were unable to have stable home and family and relationship lives. So that period of the sort of late 80s was really, I think, a lot of hopelessness and a lot of despair, and really not being able to offer people much in the way of treatment or anything that would meaningfully change their lives. And I think I mentioned this earlier in the session that I was chairing, where I recalled that at that time, in the late 80s, we were saying to people, don't test, because there are no treatments, that HIV stigma is incredibly entrenched and scary. So don't test, but make sure that you use a condom and you look after your health and do all the exercise, stress management stuff. So basically, I think we said everybody should consider themselves to be HIV positive at that time. Testing wasn't widespread, and it was sort of a strategy of the time. I think in a way it was probably appropriate, that knowing you've got HIV when you can do nothing for the person, except some early experimental attempts to try and deal with the different symptoms, I think it was probably an adaptation that made sense at the time, or a strategy that made sense at the time. And now we're in a position where the session I've just chaired, an ethicist presented a session, a talk saying that at a theoretical level, knowing your status mandatory is ethically justifiable. She said we can't force people to have the test or force people to disclose the test, but you can basically make it mandatory for them to have an annual HIV test and keep the information to themselves if they want to, but that ethically, given that the treatment is available and people have the right to health, they can only access that right if they actually have an HIV test. So this is something about how far the debates have come and gone.
Yeah.
And then I started working more formally in epidemic in 1990, sort of full time. I was still completing my master's degree, but I started to work in a Hillbrow-based AIDS program. It was essentially the Johannesburg City Council's AIDS response, and it was an absolutely fascinating period to be involved in a formal way in epidemic, because we were based in a building which was in Esalen Street, which became widely known as a really innovative, comprehensive sexual health program. We had an HIV testing service, we had TB, we had contraception, there were STI treatments, there was an outreach program to sex workers and gay men. All of us were employed by the City Council, and we all tried to work in an interdisciplinary, integrated way in this one building. Even ran an evening clinic for people in the area in Hillbrow who couldn't come to these services during the day. Every Thursday there was an evening clinic. So it was a fascinating time to be doing this work, and it was really groundbreaking work, and it was, I think that the fact that it was so integrated made it quite unique at the time. And we had the status of an ATIC, an AIDS Training and Information Centre, of which by now there were beginning to be many more around the country. These were municipal-focused HIV responses, and they were often at the core of the work that was happening. Well, I think that the indifference to the gay and MSM epidemic continued, but I think the fact that it was affecting heterosexuals as well added a new flavor to the debates and the discussions, and was, I guess, the build-up to the Nkosa process, which was around between sort of 91, 92, 93, somewhere around about there, which was the sort of a nationally coordinated consultation process, which brought ANC health desk, and the ANC hadn't been formally unbanned at the time, but it was, you know, I think Mantu Chabalala, in fact, was one of the key persons at the time, you know, and had a very different reputation of being progressive and an important figure then in helping to bring all these different parties together. And I remember being part of the team that worked on the counselling strategy with Peter Bassi. So I think we co-wrote some of the counselling strategy at that in the very beginning. So I think what the heterosexual, the realization that there was the beginnings of a heterosexual epidemic wasn't greeted with urgency that it deserved, because we could have probably had a different trajectory for the epidemic if we had intervened differently then. But there was still a lot of denial and resistance, and I think the fact that we had the contrast of the MSM epidemic seeming to be primarily white gay men, white persons, and that the heterosexual epidemic was beginning to be evident in black South Africans. You know, the seeds for interesting racial and sexual dynamics were already sown then, in some ways. But there was a lot of excitement about the Nkosa process and a lot of bringing together of people across the political spectrum. So it was an interesting period of, I suppose, synergy and agreement and consensus building, and, you know, that this plan, which was essentially the draft that was presented to the first ANC government, was a pretty good one, actually, for its time. But I think it was easy to forget that the grouping who were working on it represented a lot of progressive voices, and that the broader population was largely probably quite ignorant of AIDS, and B, probably quite judgmental, you know, and stigmatizing, that it was still very much a disease of the other. Yeah. You know, it was still seen as a disease of gay men or sex workers or drug users, and then I suppose constructed as a disease of blackness as well. It forced people into the same room who wouldn't otherwise have been in the same room. And I think some really interesting things started to happen as a result of that. You know, it was a vehicle to say, well, there's a new common struggle which, you know, can unite us and bring people from different worlds together. So I mean, I think that is, I don't know my first response to your question was, did you mean people who were in the anti-apartheid movement out of the country? But I think inside South Africa, yes, absolutely, that is what began to happen. It's true. I mean, and I think, you know, if you just think about the Nkosa process itself, I mean, it just brought together so many different people from diverse backgrounds. And if I think about the program that I worked in, I mean, we were working, it was very racially mixed in terms of, you know, and gender and sexual orientation. So there was a sense of, you know, we just breaking out of all the kind of boxes and really looking at the fascinating diversity of who we were in that team was already a statement in itself. I think ahead of its time, really, in terms of crossing those traditional divisions. I mean, I think, you know, the person who started that AIDS centre in Hillbrow that I mentioned was a doctor called Clive Evian, who had a history of being in sort of progressive primary healthcare network and being interested in community health issues, you know, from a very young age. So he brought, in a sense, his political and struggle credentials to the AIDS arena, and I think that infused into our centre, you know, our thinking about trying to locate HIV in a social understanding, rather than just seeing it as about individuals who've had unsafe sex. And that really was very important. And I think quite soon after that, you know, he paired up with my current boss, who I worked with met then, Mary Crew, who was a sort of a sociologist and historian from Wits. And I think she added to that sort of sense that AIDS is about, as much about our political and social past as about sex today. And so,
Sheila Marks kind of brought that up, didn't she?
yeah,
Waiting to happen.
absolutely. That the whole sort of way in which apartheid configured South African population made so many more people vulnerable in millions of different ways. There were a lot of questions in the beginning. Why did South Africa's epidemic seem to take off later in some ways than epidemics of other African countries? And I think there was a sense in which our borders were not as porous, and the fact that apartheid isolated us. I mean, the cordon sanitaire was as much imposed from the outside as it was from the inside. And so we were sort of held at bay from the epidemic, and vice versa. Obviously, the fact that people traveled and moved around across borders did happen, and then ultimately internal migration has been as much of an issue as anything else. But it's almost as if the conditions were all there, and when the virus came, it just exploded out. And you can see that antenatal graph that just climbed dramatically from 1990. But I think the Soul City idea of edutainment, as it was termed, was something that took hold. And I remember when I worked at the City Council in the 90s, we developed a drama with council workers, which went an AIDS play, essentially, which went around to whole ranges of city council municipal employees, and it had a sort of a gender violence theme and sexual agency, which was, I suppose, quite progressive at the time. Had a little black cast, some of whom ultimately, I think one of the actresses is now acting in Isidingo as Ma Agnes. Keketso Semoko worked for us at the time. So she helped. So she was one of the early people getting involved in AIDS theatre, Puppets Against AIDS. I think I became AREP. There was a lot of interesting stuff. And the media we were developing at the time was fascinating. I think, posters and plays and We had comic strips for gay men, which we put into gay publications and stuff, just a lot of interesting stuff. Sex worker clinics, all that stuff was happening in the 90s when I was working in Hillbrow. So I suppose from a political perspective, the early years, I mean, the ATIC system was in place, and there was a provincial AIDS program, a national AIDS program, but I think that the implementation of the Nkosa plan was not great, and that particularly in the Mandela years were characterized, I suppose, by, from his perspective, quite a lot of silence around AIDS. Actually, he didn't make it a key of his presidency. I think he was more about nation building and trying to reach across divisions and look towards the future. So, AIDS coming into that mix was not desirable and not palatable and not part of the reconciliation plan, to be honest.
Yeah, it was kind of overshadowed, wasn't it, by the transformation?
Yeah, it was. Trying to remember who the health. It was it Nkosazana Zuma was one of the early ministers of health under Mandela, I think. And then there were the sort of the Virodine Sarafina scandals, or Virofina as I call them, because they somehow were the terrible twins. Yeah, the idea that you could have an AIDS drama which cost a lot of money. I think Mbongeni Ngema was the playwright who got lots and lots and lots of money. That hasn't changed. He's still getting lots of money to do stories now. Yeah, and the play was kind of, I think aesthetically it was very pleasing. Lots of singing and dancing and happiness, and with the thread of AIDS woven into it, and perhaps very simplistic or moralistic messages. But it just, it's not going to change people's material living conditions or the reasons for them getting involved in unprotected sex in the first place. And there were scandals around tendering and waste of money, and it was a mess, frankly. And then Virodine was also terrible. I mean, it was seemingly, this rogue scientists from the University of Pretoria decided that this industrial solvent had shown some promise in some laboratory test, and pretty soon, without, I think, ethical clearance, were testing it out on poor people, most of them black, subsequently, but then it was Mozambicans who were coming to South Africa. I had a client I was counseling at the time in the sort of middle to late 90s, around the time of the Virodine stuff, who actually took Virodine, the patches. He traveled to Pretoria, and he was prescribed them by Olga and her team. It didn't make a difference. I mean, he died. No, I mean, he was already very ill and going blind, I think, with CMV retinitis at the time. So he was desperate for something, and this probably predated the use of AZT, or AZT wasn't working either. But I think that from a political angle, the fact that it was clear that they got money, that they got money from the cabinet to do some of that research, and it bypassed all kinds of ethical norms, checks and balances. And I think, that sort of raised debates about we need an African solution. And I think could be, I think Mbeki was in the cabinet then already. So this thread around Western medicine is experimenting on Africans. And we need to find and own our own solutions, not only from traditional medicine perspective, but also there could be cures and treatments that are located in Africa, which African scientists need to own. So in a way, by thumbing their nose, is that the right expression? At the Western medical establishment by doing the whole Virodine thing. I mean, they were practicing on poor black people, you know, without proper medicine control council checks and balances. I don't think it was approved by any ethics board. And I think leading into the Mbeki era, you know, that became entrenched in those years. You know, I mean, I think that was probably the most difficult time in the fight against AIDS, because it really felt like the AIDS establishment, which was mostly good people trying to do good work, were at war with the Minister of Health and the President. And there was a lot of maneuvering and attempting to do work in spite of and not because of the state, or the government, should I say, or key figures in government. I mean, looking back on it now, it was kind of bizarre what happened. You know, there was that Castro-Hlungwane document, which you've probably come across, you know, which was this incredibly long rave. And I think Peter Mokaba might have been implicated in writing it or been involved in it in some way. I mean, he subsequently died of AIDS, as did...
He was apparently the ghostwriter.
Yeah.
That's what I heard.
And, you know, it was and then subsequently, I think Parks Mankahlana was also Mbeki's spokesman, died of AIDS, and it was the disease that dare not speak its name, but in a new way, you know, that, you know, you couldn't say people were dying of AIDS because the very fact of AIDS and its link to HIV was questioned. How can a virus cause a syndrome, he said, you know, Mbeki very, very clearly. And I remember him quoting research from medical journals in Parliament and saying, here, look, they say there are these terrible side effects, these are poison. But what he would admit, I seem to remember, was that the conclusion of the journal was, in spite of the side effects, the drugs should still be administered because they ultimately save lives. So he was selectively reading medical texts. And I think just before, around the time of the 2000 AIDS conference here in Durban, which was the International AIDS Conference, which was hosted for the first time in South Africa, he set up the Presidential Advisory Panel on AIDS, you know, which was a mix of dissidents and regular scientists. I think Peter Duisberg might have been one of the early ones. You know, and it was just a bizarre attempt to say, well, can we get, you know, consensus building approach to science? Doesn't matter what the evidence says, or, you know, you look at it and you vote, and the winning vote wins in deciding whether HIV causes AIDS. From an international perspective, we were embarrassed by what was going on. Thank you. I know people were horrified. I mean, there was a lot of despair and hopelessness and anxiety, you know, and people were, and anger. People were really pissed off and upset about what was happening. And, you know, I mean, I think that the rise of the TAC can be seen in the light of those years, you know, that something has to be done, and TAC's ability to mobilize and to be grassroots based and to have a very strong political agenda rooted in rights and strong legal support was just very much in parallel with those early years. And I think also the idea, you know, perhaps the first time that there was a sense that civil society elements could be at odds with, which themselves were progressive, could be at odds with a democratic government. You know, that idea that this is a government of liberation, that largely has the support of everybody, but it is being challenged by within its own ranks, you know. So I do think that was it was quite a fraught time, you know, and allegations of and disloyalty and unpatriotism. And I mean, you know, if you read some of the stuff that Mbeki wrote at the time, I think also that what for him was very difficult was the idea that the epidemic could have taken such hold in Africa, and that he interpreted the fact that people wanted to present these statistics and present the difficult stories of AIDS in Africa were not motivated by a desire by racism, or by a view that African people essentially are sexually promiscuous and cannot control their sexual appetites.
I think the phrase he used was prisoners of our own lust.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I've read some of those things. One did try and read them to understand, because I think from my own perspective, it was a matter of trying to understand that these weren't the actions of someone who was just willfully trying to be at odds with the AIDS establishment. I mean, I think he genuinely held those views as an Africanist, as a believer in the African Union, in African solutions, and African dignity. I think he genuinely believed that he had a mission to challenge this. Well, I mean, I think he was and is, to some degree, has a lot of arrogance and pride as an individual. I think that is his personality. This is me as a shrink speaking, I suppose. He has the personality style. And it almost felt like once he had gone down that path, he couldn't go back from it very easily without losing a lot of face. And it would have been very undignified to backtrack, having really nailed his colours to the mast. So I kind of feel like he painted himself into a corner. I mean, I think the terms, genocide and TRC have been bandied about, and I can remember a long time ago, and it sounds a bit arrogant to say it now, because I don't believe I was the first person to say it, thinking, I wonder if there's going to be a TRC around AIDS, particularly around the Mbeki years, because we need a kind of a healing to understand what happened then. I mean, I think a historian might say that given Mbeki's place and time in South Africa's history, his ideas around Africanism and his resistance to the ideas of the West using Africa as a sort of medical playground, and resisting Western constructions of African sexuality, I think they were of the time. That he, it was almost maybe there was almost an inevitability that someone like him would hold those viewpoints. Maybe that's a more generous interpretation, but a historian would say, well, he was reflecting the debates and issues of that period. I think a different lens, like a public health person might say, with justification, many people died through neglect and the failure of the government to actually intervene in the face of evidence. I mean, there is irony in Africanist who believes in African lives and African people and African futures being the cause of the deaths of many African people. So it wasn't, I don't believe, malintent. He didn't wake up one morning and say, how can I ensure that many of my people who are poor, largely poor and black, who are dying, will be exterminated? I mean, I can't see that. So it was tied up with his own personal political convictions, but in the time in the country's liberation, perhaps his thinking came out of those roots. Maybe I'm being overly generous in my interpretation, trying to understand where did he come from? He didn't just arise out of nothing.